There's a surprisingly large number of people who came to the Czech Republic right at the country's beginning in the early 90s, or even before it was the Czech Republic and it was still Czechoslovakia, but after the Velvet Revolution. And those people have seen a lot of changes over the decades. One such person is Jonathan Stein, who first came here in 1991. He is currently the managing editor for Project Syndicate, an independent news source. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, Derek. It's very nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on, and thank everybody for listening to this episode of Prague Times. A city is much more than just a collection of buildings. It's a location, it's a history, it's a culture, it's ideas and ideals, and a city is also, most importantly, the people in it. This is Prague Times, the podcast that takes a look at the city of Prague in the Czech Republic. With more than 1,000 years of history, there's a lot to talk about. We'll talk about the past of Prague, but we'll also talk about the city as it is today, future plans for the city, and much more. It's Prague then, Prague now, and Prague later. And this is Prague Times. Okay, Jonathan, so you came here, you told me 1991 is when you first came here. Why did you come here?
In a former life, I was a wannabe academic and I was in a PhD program. And, these massive changes happened. I grew up with, the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And I figured that was the normal. And then it stopped being normal and everything fell apart in Central and Eastern Europe, the communist regimes. And I thought this was, would be a very interesting phenomenon to observe. I helped to set up a program that brought young American social scientists to then Czechoslovakia. I think it was 14 universities in Czechoslovakia at the time. And, the universities had no economics department. They had no political science departments. Sociology was limited to very controlled opinion polling. It was very, very bleak, and the universities were very eager to sort of retool. So we came in and I taught in the fall of 1991. I taught at social sciences faculty at Charles and at Vysoká škola ekonomická, VŠE, the economics university in Prague. And in the spring, I taught in Olomouc at Palacký University. I really enjoyed it. I went back to the States for a year and then decided to come back. I've been back and been living here in now the Czech Republic since 1993.
Wow. Continuously.
Yes, continuously. And of course, you make a move like that at a point in your life when you're, single and not going to be single for much longer. And that change happened to me here. And I married a Czech woman and had Czech babies and got a Czech mortgage and chalupa and the whole thing. And the next thing you know, your life is just here, which I'm very happy about. Absolutely no regrets.
No regrets. It was the right move.
Right. It was exactly the right move. And I got off the academic track back there in the 1990s. I published an academic book that wasn't my dissertation, and I realized that this wasn't what I wanted to do. But I liked the writing. I liked the editing. I ended up for years working for the Economist Intelligence Unit, covering the Czech Republic and Slovakia, writing long country reports with political and economic analysis. And, I was also editing a lot of academic books for professors, for university presses. And that got me onto Project Syndicate, which started out as a part-time job. It was 1 day a week, then 2 days a week. And I was still doing stuff for the EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit. And I was sort of freelancing. And Project Syndicate just sort of continued to grow and grow until about I guess 2008 or so. I just dropped everything else and became a full-time editor with them, and we've grown since then. And it used to be just me, and now there's there are 4 other editors that I've brought on to handle the increasing workload.
So what is Project Syndicate in a nutshell?
A very bold and interesting and fortunately successful idea. And the idea started back there in the early 1990s. There was an institution here in Prague called the Central European University, which then moved to Budapest. And now the Orban regime in Hungary has kicked out Central European University after many years of being housed in central Budapest. And it's now in Vienna. But at the time, it started in Prague in the early 1990s, and they had a sort of an academic research project through their economics department, and it was called the Privatization Project. And they published, I think, 3 or 4 books on post-communist economic reform. In 1993, it was wrapping up. One of the things that the Privatization Project had been doing was sending supplements. There were sort of feature-length supplements to newspapers around the region in post-communist Europe about economic reform. And when the Privatization Project was going to close down, many of these editors from around the region said, well, what about these supplements? We like them, we use them. Will there be anything like that continuing? You know, the guys who were running the Privatization Project didn't really think about this, but they thought, hey, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe we just start up a kind of a syndicate, these kinds of supplements and maybe commentaries. And well, what do we call it? Well, we don't know. We had the Privatization Project. Let's just call this Project Syndicate because that's the next project, right? And of course, the name stuck and nobody ever changed it. It became a brand. And so now it sounds like, I work for, some shady organization.
It sounds a little mafioso.
Right. I like it. It's got a certain cachet. It continued to grow from there. We got a couple of authors who were interested in the region, who were very, very devoted to writing, and they wanted to write often. And that was Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia and Joe Stiglitz, who went on to win a Nobel Prize. And, these guys have been our authors for more than 20 years, right? From the outset. I didn't join until 2001. It was already, 6 or 7 years old, but it was very small then. It was, we were doing maybe 10 commentaries a month and had maybe 50 or 55 newspapers, mainly in the region in Europe. And, and now we have more than 500 newspapers and publications around the world. And we publish probably 110 commentaries a month. And we have lots of other, features, interviews and long reads and a podcast and newsletters, various other content that we're putting out. And it works because the model is very simple. It's not a non-commercial model. And we operate, on a nonprofit basis. Any newspaper can join in any country. It doesn't matter if they can pay. If they're in a rich country, we're going to expect them to pay. If they're in a poor country, then they'll get our content free or at a subsidized rate. That model has made us very attractive to a lot of authors because a lot of authors want to be read in developing countries, and the New York Times can't get them in there, or other commercial press syndicates have to make money. They can't go into a country like Mali or Niger and just give their content away. And we do. We can and we do. And that's stood us in very good stead with a lot of authors. If you're Jeffrey Sachs or Danny Roderick, a famous development economist, you want to be read in these countries. You don't want to only be read in France and Germany and Spain, where we also have member newspapers. The secret really has been that, many of these newspapers, they can't get the Nobel laureates and the presidents and prime ministers that we provide them with. And so they join Project Syndicate and they take a feed from us, when we tailor it, to their needs. And we have, 4 people here in Prague. Their entire job is simply to manage these relationships. Well, when there's not a pandemic, they fly around the world, they go to conferences, they, meet with our member editors, they find out, what they're interested in and what they want, and they place new content that we have, and many of the newspapers that we carried for many years, a Kenyan newspaper, for example. Kenya has now had significant economic growth for the past decade and a half, and we get a message from our members in Kenya saying, you carried us for 20 years, now we want to start paying. It's very gratifying to see that. that's not an isolated example. Many of our papers, they've been paying and then they fall on hard times. They have to have budget cuts, and we carry them for 6 months or a year or 2 years until they get back on their feet, until they, sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes they're just going under, and that's the newspaper business these days.
Right.
That happens. But very often, they'll come back and they'll say, thanks for carrying us. We now can, start contributing again. And they do. And it works well. For a long time, just our syndication, just our newspapers around the world, that was enough to meet our budget. Obviously, that's changed with a lot of publications moving completely online where the advertising revenues aren't there. Everybody's trying to get to a subscription model. We are as well. And that means that, we've had to turn to other sources. We now have a lot of grant parts that
Right.
help support us. But it's continued to grow. We run a lean operation. We're not necessarily a household name, but in newsrooms around the world, we are a household name. We're sort of behind the scenes. You often see, the copyright project syndicate at the bottom of a piece, but you don't know what that is, right? You don't see. We're trying now to kind of build up our own presence on the web, through our own website, which is working. We're getting subscribers, and it's coming along. But still, our syndication business is the bread and butter. But it's up to I think about a little more than 150 countries, have a project syndicate member. So it really is global. And the other thing that needs to be said is that we only do commentaries on the news, on economic events, on trends. An issue like Brexit or the U.S. election will tie us up for months. We'll just have so much material on those kinds of issues. We also have a lot of stuff on development issues. We have a partnership with the Gates Foundation, and they're very interested in immunization, in clean water and sanitation in developing countries. We run a lot of content on that stuff, a lot of content on women's issues and by women, and very often, in developing countries. It's a very, very broad range of content that we produce on a lot of different subjects, everything from Islam and human rights to fiscal and monetary policy and China and Russia and you name it, which keeps it very interesting. I mean, it's been a very interesting job to have because you're constantly learning.
So you were here all through that 90s privatization process that Václav Klaus, who was prime minister at the time, sort of spearheaded. Walk us through that. Walk us through how that happened, how that first round of privatization occurred, and then when the second wave of privatization coupons hit the populace, suddenly they could trade them, and they all ended up selling them to investment funds, investment fundi, and things like this. Because, Rob Cameron had mentioned that one of the reasons why the Czech Republic did as well as it did is because of this enormous amount of foreign investment. And so it'd be interesting to how did that happen?
Czechoslovakia was in a very favorable position in 1989 in terms of its macroeconomic position. It wasn't like Poland where public finances were falling apart and you had to do extreme, austerity right from the bat. The Czechoslovak authorities had an entire year to kind of plan things out. Nothing really changed in 1990 throughout the year. That was when they kind of mapped out how they were going to carry out economic reform. And obviously, this was also a time when Civic Forum, which was the opposition or revolutionary movement that led to November 17th, 1989, that formed in the aftermath out of the dissident movement, and it brought together former 1968 reform communists with a more kind of technocratic elite. And that technocratic elite was led by people like Václav Klaus, who wasn't a dissident. He was sort of in this gray zone. He worked for Economic Forecasting Institute of the Academy of Sciences. A lot of them did. So did Miloš Zeman. Many of the people who came out of that generation, formed that elite, came out of that Economic Forecasting Institute. And Klaus obviously was one of the driving forces behind breaking up Civic Forum, getting away from so-called non-political politics and forming political parties. And he formed the Civic Democratic Party out of Civic Forum. And that became kind of a very popular party because here was a guy who sounded extremely competent, was very obviously very intelligent, knowledgeable. He spoke English, he spoke German. At the time, this was very impressive. He didn't seem like the others. If they had been dissidents, they'd been great writers, but stoking coal for 20 years, and
Right.
and there had been kind of some skills erosion involved in normalization, that preceded 1989, this sort of deep freeze, authoritarian communism. When they launched reform in 1991, they did it in two phases. There was a small privatization, which was all of the kind of retail stores and restaurants and bars and these kinds of things, and then a large-scale privatization. When I first was here in 1991, small-scale privatization was just getting underway. But, Prague was, at night, it was a ghost town. There was nothing to do. Really, I mean, you just see sort of young people walking around in the streets or in parks and looking in windows. Really, there wasn't much because small privatization hadn't really started yet. Things opened up very quickly and kind of life was returned to the city and to the country. And then large-scale privatization began in 1992 with, as you mentioned, coupon privatization was one of the big mechanisms used to transfer assets from state ownership to private ownership. Before that, there were a couple of big kind of foreign direct investment deals. I think, as early as 1990, the, Skoda Auto was just sold to Volkswagen. I mean, there was no way that you could make that company competitive, in Europe or much less globally without a huge foreign strategic investor. I'm sure, I don't know the details of the deal and I don't want to mislead your listeners, but I'm sure that there were all kinds of sweeteners in the deal that the state gave them in terms of building infrastructure, tax abatements, what have you, because so much investment was required there by Volkswagen in order to make that a competitive concern. And the state obviously had an interest in maintaining employment levels. They didn't want a massive wave of layoffs. So all of that stuff, had to be agreed. I know that this was one of the main economic policy concerns in 1990 for the government, even as it was planning out the rest of economic reform. You have to remember that Czechoslovakia was one of the most state-owned economies in the communist bloc, in the Soviet bloc. 96% of capital in this country, land and buildings and businesses, factories, was owned by the state. I think East Germany and Czechoslovakia were had the highest share of state ownership. Then you had countries like Hungary that had kind of this goulash communism, a mixed regime. Poland had agricultural land in private hands. So the state had to offload all of these assets very quickly. It wanted to do this. It didn't want to keep a lot of property, a lot of in state ownership. The coupon privatization was a very kind of a novel scheme. The idea was that you would give everybody in the country, every citizen, a coupon book worth 1,000 crowns. And it was politically an extremely savvy move as well, because at the time, Václav Klaus was the Czechoslovak federal finance minister. And of course, he signed every coupon book. His signature was right there with his name, and he was he had formed a political party that was going to contest the 1992 elections. Everybody knew him. He had said he couldn't lose. He was giving everybody something that they thought was valuable. But there was one problem with this scheme. You get 1,000 crowns, and you're supposed to invest it in some state-owned asset. But which asset? Why? Who knows anything? Who has any information, any financial information on any of these businesses that are being privatized? Well, certainly not Jan Novak. He has no clue. So what happened was these investment funds were formed. And obviously one of the most famous is the Harvard Investment Fund, started by a guy named Victor Kozheny, who is now wanted in several countries, including this one, and lives in the Bahamas. He was a corrupt actor, and many of them were, unfortunately. What happened was that the investment funds would run advertisements on the sides of trams, on television, on radio, saying, sign over your coupon book, your 1,000-crown coupon book to us, and we'll return within a year or 2 years 10,000 crowns. You'll get 10,000 crowns back. Many of these concerns, there was no enforcement, there was no regulation. Klaus didn't believe in any of this. It really was, and many of these investment funds went belly up. Many people never saw their 1,000 crowns, much less 10,000 crowns, ever again. But that sort of went with the spirit of the time, which was, look, we've got all of these assets. We're going to try to do this as fairly as possible. But really, at some point, you just have to turn out the lights for a period of time. And when you turn them on, that distribution of property is the one that you start with, right? And we go from there. You know, and look, I mean, if you trace the history of private property back far enough, you're always going to find theft. You know, that's just a fact. There's a reason why you don't do that, why you don't go beyond a certain date. And I'll give you an example from here. The coupon privatization and the small privatization of retail, this wasn't the only way that the state got rid of assets. Also, another very important channel was restitution of property to owners before the communists took over in 1948. They could reclaim factories. They could reclaim, in some cases, castles, apartment buildings, all kinds of property. I once ran into, in the early 1990s, a young Canadian kid. He was in his early 20s, and he had he'd never been here before, but his family was from Prague, and he had gotten back a huge building downtown, and he immediately flipped it. And he became a multimillionaire kind of overnight through restitution. A lot of people did that. And you may even still see buildings downtown. You know, you think, why is that building a wreck? Why is it unoccupied? It's because it's still in court, because heirs have gone to court against each other, fighting each other for the asset, you know, and you still get these restitution battles playing out. The interesting thing, though, is, and this gets back to the kind of the trace private property back far enough, and, you know, you won't want to go any farther. The restitution laws set a very clear limit on 1948. They weren't going to go back any farther than 1948. For example, they could have gone back to 1938. But if they'd gone back to 1938, then you'd be restituting victims of Nazi crimes, right? It just became too complicated.
Right. We got to draw a line somewhere. Let's make it here.
Right. At the time, there was a lot of nervousness about Sudetengerman claims, right? You know, people who had been expelled after 1945. And it was very interesting that this was not, privatization was not simply some kind of technocratic economic efficiency enhancing development. You had massive sociological implications. There was a poll, I remember back in the 1990s, who most of the population of the Czech population believed was deserving of restitution, right? And people who were expropriated, store owners, obviously, they should have their property returned. Sudetengermans, absolutely not. Catholic Church, absolutely not. Aristocracy, absolutely not. Jews, okay. Yeah, they can have some. It really became kind of a nation-defining act. You know, what are the boundaries of the nation, right? That's also being defined by these property laws, these restitution laws. One of the interesting features of the economic reform here in the 1990s was, although state-owned assets were sold off very quickly, one very important state-owned asset was not sold off, and that was the financial sector, the big banks. This is Komerční banka, Československá obchodní banka, Česká spořitelna. There were four of them, and they were really, really crucial to the political success of Klaus's reform. Because what was happening, although Klaus came across as a very good sort of Reagan, Thatcherite, neoliberal, free market guy, he did two things that ameliorated the effects or the pain of reform on the population and that kept capitalism popular. One was rent control. He transferred the social welfare costs onto new private owners of apartments and apartment buildings, and kept rent control in place, so that whereas, in the West, policymakers think that a household budget, 25% or 30% of the income should go to housing expenses, whether rent or mortgage payments. Here, it was down to about 10% in the 1990s because of rent control. And that gave people a cushion that made the adjustment costs of the transition much more bearable. The other important move was not privatizing the banks. Throughout the entire 1990s, the banks were not privatized, and they became a kind of a substitute for the subsidizing ministries under communism. You could get the bank to simply subsidize that tractor factory in Moravia that was losing money hand over fist so that it wouldn't lay off the workers, right? You could keep employment up.
Right.
And that continued. There was this gradual adjustment, but it didn't have to be because of the banks' shock therapy. Now, what happened at the end of the 1990s, of course, were the banks were in terrible shape. The banks had huge volumes of non-performing loans, and they had to be sold off very quickly. And interestingly, the bank that was sold off first was ČSOB, Československá obchodní banka, and it was sold to a Belgian bank. And it was the first to be sold for a very simple reason. It didn't own any of these coupon investment funds. It was not involved at all in coupon privatization, which ended up being a complete mess. Because you'd have these coupon funds that owned these companies. The coupon funds then would be tied up with these state-owned banks, and the state-owned banks would basically channel subsidies to the companies that its own investment coupon funds owned.
Right.
And this was a recipe for disaster. So at the end of this decade, these banks had to be sold off. It was no longer sustainable, and the first one to be sold off was ČSOB, because it wasn't involved in coupon privatization. Why alone among the banks did it have the foresight to say, no, we shouldn't be involved in this. It'll be a world of trouble financially. The reason was very simple, and I found this out because I actually, around 1999 or 2000, the bank hired me to write a study of their privatization. So I got to interview the entire board of the bank. They gave me all of these materials, and I was able to kind of dig in. And what I found out was very simple. They were Czechoslovakia's trade bank. They settled all of Czechoslovakia's external trade. They were not a retail bank. They were not a commercial bank at all. And all of that got going for them only in the 1990s. And the guy who was the head of the bank, he had previously been, and again, this is kind of gets into the interesting sort of the sociology of the economic structure and the economic policy in the country. But he had been under communism. He had also worked for ČSOB, and he spoke flawless English. And I said, where did you learn your flawless English? And he said, in the 1970s and 1980s, I worked for the bank in London. He handled ČSOB's business, settling, trade payments and so forth in the city of London. To have that kind of job in Czechoslovakia in the 70s and 80s, you can imagine what his connections were with the regime. And but he was not alone. I mean, this was a class of people. I don't want to say that they were, commie bad guys, because they weren't. They were the technocrats, and you get them in any kind of regime, in a democratic regime, in an authoritarian regime. They're the people who keep the lights on, who keep the state running. It's not about Marx. It's about Weber. It's about bureaucracy, keeping things at least barely rational. And, in terms of state administration. And that's what these guys were. And they rose to the top, in this new regime very easily. You remember that in the early 1990s, you were here. You remember that they had this lustration process, this lustration law, that people who had collaborated with the secret police or had been above a certain level in the Communist Party couldn't hold many state positions. The entire private economy was exempt from this. As companies were privatized, many of the people who had been running them, in the past were kept on, whether they were running it now or whether they were now a deputy director or whatever it was. and somebody who with a an untainted past was brought in, above them. This happened throughout the economy, right? Because these were the people who knew what was what, and you needed them. You needed them. These people very often, more often than not, do a very good job, and they're kind of unsung. Now, was there a good bit of self-dealing on some of these people's part? Many of these people's part? I'm sure of it. Was there corruption and bribery to get a building permit or to change the designation of a parcel in a land registry? Absolutely. I mean, there was tons of it constantly, and you could see the kind of the ethic, back there especially in the 1990s, just by getting into a taxi cab and not knowing what the guy was going to charge you,
or if you would reach your destination.
right. And that unregulated taxi market, it did a lot of harm to the country, and this was another one of Klaus's commitments to the free market, that we won't impose any kind of regulation on taxi drivers, and the country got a bad reputation for it. I mean, it really, you get out of off a train, you go to the train station, and you're charged 1,000 crowns to go 3 blocks. You wonder about the country that you've just sat down in. I remember once getting into a taxi. And I just wanted to go home. I'd been working late, and it was 2 a.m, and the taxi driver, we were driving along Magistral, and he points over to a club, and he says, "You want a girl?" I'm like, "No, I just want to go home." Okay, continue driving. There's another bar. He slows down. He says, "You want drugs? Anything you want." I'm like, "Look, we're on the right route. Just take me home." The third one was, "You need somebody killed? That bar over there, 5,000 crowns, you can have somebody killed." And I'm like, okay, well, hold on, slow down a minute. I think no, one or two people, but it wasn't taxi.
Remember what it's like? We were in a group of people. Whoever spoke the best Czech had to sit in the front seat and engage the driver in chit chat, so that A, the guy would think you were nice and not try and screw you too bad, and B, so you could keep an eye on the meter.
Right.
Those were the days.
I remember this was 1991. I remember walking into, and restaurants were still state owned. Small privatization hadn't been completed. And I remember walking into, it was right next to the Slavia. It was a restaurant next to the Slavia. And I walked in with my girlfriend, and the place was completely empty. And I said, table for 2, please. And they said, "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I don't." "Well, I'm sorry, you need a reservation." Right. And I'm looking around, it's completely empty. But of course, it's a state-owned restaurant, so they're going to get paid whether they have customers or not. So we're just more work for them. Why should they happily seat us and serve us? So I went outside and I went to a payphone, and I called the restaurant and I said, "I would like a reservation." And they said, "For when?" And I said, "For 5 minutes from now." And okay, I walked back in. Okay, you have a reservation. I mean, it was this kind of bizarre.
That's Kafka.
Mentality, right? Yeah. And I don't know if you remember the magic phones to appear. You'd come up out of the metro or get off a tram or a bus, and there would be a line at a payphone, because the coin wasn't dropping in the payphone. So people were calling their friends in Israel or Argentina, and you could stay on for, and things like that just happened. It was very, I remember, in Olomouc, for 2 months in the fall of 1991, some kid in the mathematics faculty had figured out that if you dialed 0150 before any phone number, you could call anywhere in the world for free from any payphone in Olomouc. And it was some old communist era, code, that for party bigwigs. And at the time, at Czechoslovakia Spoja, which was the telecom at the time, was on a 2-month billing cycle. So they didn't find out about this for 2 months and then they shut it down, obviously. But so for 2 months, you'd have people setting up party lines. I mean, it was hilarious. You'd have a little gathering next to every payphone in the town.
So that was then, back in the 90s, privatization, taxi cabs, and bureaucratic shenanigans. I'd like to thank Jonathan Stein, managing editor of Project Syndicate, for talking to me today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me, Derek.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Don't forget to check the episode notes for links to Project Syndicate and other things that were mentioned in this episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of Prague Times. If you liked this episode, be sure to like it or share it and tell your friends. Check us out on all of our social media platforms for extra goodies as well. Until next time, this has been Prague Times.